A great realignment is occurring where the United States appears to be declaring independence from European interest and more generally Europe and how it handles its geopolitical matters. And while this is a positive development, and while I do think this has good tidings for us as Americans in the future, it is worth the while for us to explore the many different ways in which Europe has actually influenced our nation for both the good and also the worse, and to figure out how we can holistically declare independence from Europe with so many different influences in different areas of our society that are oftentimes not considered. So in this video, we're going to go over the more recent developments that have happened with the Trump administration, declaring a strategic realignment with the European continent. And then we're going to actually explore the history of American relations with Europe on a civilizational level, most importantly, to see exactly the importance of what's going on here. But before we explore all that, my friends, hope all of you are doing well. I'm Christian Watson. Thank you so much for being here. If you enjoy political and social commentary with a philosophical bent, then I must implore you, please like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can, my friends, to ensure that our message remains in the algorithm and to ensure our message gets to more people. We are close to 20,000 subscribers, my friends. Once we hit that milestone, I believe we're going to be on a bigger roll than we are right now. But in order to do that, I need your help. So if you want to, of course, like, share, comment, and subscribe, that'd be awesome. If you would like to go the extra mile and donate as well, no obligation, but if you'd like to, that helps me continue to bring this content to you on a more consistent basis. Thank all of you so much, and please enjoy the video. So, we've seen, since the beginning of the Trump administration, several events that suggest a strategic and a geopolitical realignment of American interests with European interests. And by the way, this is a long time coming. Many people have shouted to the rooftops about the dangers of entangling alliances and the dangers of the United States being an interventionist power within the world, causing ruin and war wherever we intervene, as opposed to peace and prosperity for all. And so, to a lot of people, this has been music to their ears. For example, J.D. Vance made a rather rousing speech at the Munich Security Council, where he called out the European leaders' unwillingness to engage in their own self-preservation when it comes to immigration policy, and he forcibly asserted that America was going to, of course, follow its own interest and ensure the preservation of its own people, contrary to what they're doing.
I think this is one of the most important things I've learned in my brief time in politics. Contrary to what you might hear a couple mountains over in Davos, the citizens of all of our nations don't generally think of themselves as educated animals or as interchangeable cogs of a global economy. And it's hardly surprising that they don't want to be shuffled about or relentlessly ignored by their leaders.
Then, of course, Pete Hegseth himself said, the defense secretary, that America's security objectives will go away from Europe, and Europe would have to foot the bill and handle the majority of the work for the Ukraine war. And so these two events, and of course, Trump himself demanding a sort of peaceful resolution within the Ukraine war, and Trump himself being a little bit ambivalent as to the future of the United States within the NATO alliance. All of these different events signal a strategic repositioning. But what I find very interesting, however, is when you consider these events within the narrow context of what has happened over the past 5 years, they don't seem that significant. But if you consider these events within the broader context of the over 200 plus year history that America has had dealing with various levels and various types of European influence on a geopolitical level, on a social level, and on a conceptual level, then this is actually a rather unique time to be alive. So as I mentioned, America has been influenced on 3 levels by Europe. The more sort of intuitive and the more recent levels and has been the geopolitical level, and this has been happening ever since the late 19th century, early 20th century, with the Great Rapprochement, where once America became an imperialist state, once we began going around conquering territories around the world, Britain came along, and there was this sort of perverse strategic incentive created for Britain and America to join together. So that's one level. Then, of course, what happened decades after that, you have the post-war consensus, which has governed the world for decades now. You have the creation of NATO with the Washington Treaty, which Truman signaled as being an indispensable alliance between between shared powers, which would unite Western Europe and create a safer world. And then, of course, you have a bunch of other things that happen, the Cold War, so on and so forth. All of these things have had a direct link with European influence on the American state. NATO most certainly, because NATO has hijacked the interest, at least the geopolitical interest of America, and has filtered them towards narrow objectives which benefit, of course, the NATO alliance. And there's a very interesting thing to note here. When you investigate the nature of NATO as an alliance, scholars will oftentimes call NATO a security community. Now, a security community is actually distinct from a full-blown alliance, and I'll tell you why. A security community is a union of countries that come together based upon the idea that they share values that transcend mere material interests like security and economics, both of which were seen as justifications for the NATO alliance. Whereas an alliance is when when two states come together based on immediate strategic interests that are confined and narrow to their particular objectives. So NATO is a much more expansive thing. A community is much bigger than an alliance, because an alliance is much more narrow. It suggests a much more narrow set of propositions than a community. So if you're within a community, you now have an obligation to people within the community, regardless of the direct ties that may fashion your country with that country. So the security community actually creates liabilities, because now you're running around potentially having to help everyone despite you not having as much vested interest in that country as you may another country within the so-called community. Again, this has all been an example of perverse European influence on American geopolitics. But beyond that, because that is what's being addressed right now by Hegseth, by Trump, by Vance, and their various ruminations on this particular point. But most people are not realizing just how deep the European influence goes, going all the way back to the founding of our nation and going all the way back to the classic questions, the classic ontological questions about what is the nature of American civilization or American identity posed against the nature of European civilization and European identity. Because Europe has, in more ways than one, impacted not just our geopolitics, but also our self-image and also how we perceive and conceive of America. And most importantly, it certainly impacted the birth of our country. So in order to kind of understand the real significance of this European influence and to sufficiently declare independence from it entirely, we have to go back through history, starting, of course, at the founding. Now, when the colonists made the brave move to oppose King George and to reject the institutions and the systems of thought that dominated the European continent within the 18th century, there were a few allies that rushed to their aid, but many of those allies did so with great reservations. And one of those allies was King Gustav III of Sweden. Now, King Gustav III is an interesting case because scholars actually describe him as one of the monarchs within Europe that was the most revulsed and opposed to the American Revolution, while also still being an ally. In fact, after America had won, there was a parade that happened in New York, and there were several shouts and chants made by the people within the parade, and one of those shouts were made in jubilation and praise of King Gustav for being the kind of neutral nation within Europe when the war happened. And then, of course, that created a certain perception within America about this particular figure. But King Gustav's intentions were actually not necessarily quite pure. For example, King Gustav said of the French, who were actually a great ally of us, many of you may remember from history class, Marquis de Lafayette and other Frenchmen helping America, essentially helping America beat the British. He said of the French doing that, quote, "The action of the French ministry in recognizing American independence, it seems to me, has deviated from both the principles of justice and practical interest, and from the state principles of nations that have been in force for centuries. I cannot admit that it is right that to support rebels against their king. The example will find only too many imitators in an age when it is the fashion to overthrow every bulwark of authority. But I presume I shall have to give in this matter." That is, he agreed to join the conflict in support of America, despite believing that subjects have no right to overthrow their king. Now, this viewpoint reflects the divine right of kings, the idea that status is inherently invested with moral legitimacy, as opposed to first principles being the basis of moral legitimacy. It was status, which was a very common idea within the European continent at that time. King Gustav believed this down to his bones, but he also understood the economic potential that could come from having a relationship with this potentially fledgling new nation. So he supported America, quote unquote, even though when other Swedish nationals wanted to go ahead and support America, he did not allow them to do so openly. They had to fight under the flags of other countries other than Sweden, hence creating this idea that Sweden was a neutral country, when in all reality it was not. And then, when they came back to Sweden from America, from fighting for America, Gustav essentially said, and I quote to them, that he could not countenance giving them an award because they would be wearing a public mark of the success of subjects, of a revolt of subjects against the rightful ruler, and above all, a revolt whose cause and narratives were so unfair and so unfounded. So you had this guy who was at first a supporter of America on a pragmatic basis, but also an opponent to its core values. This was largely the European mind and belief at this place and time. And we're going to actually explore how this evolved and how there's a kind of nexus between the creation of the Republic here in America and the evolution of European thought. So you had King Gustav, who was a formative force within our founding, who hated America's concept, but on a pragmatic level, he supported it because it benefited his nation economically. Then you had Prince Heinrich of Prussia. Now, this is very interesting. There are actually two Prussian figures that influenced the formation of America. You had Otto von Bourbon, who was a general that came all the way from Prussia and helped train George Washington's Continental Army. He instilled a sense of order and hierarchy within them, and many historians actually credit his training of their army with the Continental Army's victory over the British, but also Prince Heinrich. Now, Prince Heinrich was a rather peculiar figure within Europe, and he actually was thought of potentially being the king of the Americas after the revolution had won. This is what was called the Prussian Scheme. There was a letter written to him by the then president of the Continental Congress, who essentially said, "You should be the king of our newfound country." And so there was this active push within the Americas, within people who still had European-minded ideas, that we should still have a king. In fact, it was very popular, as many of you may know, the notion of a monarchy. After the conclusion of George Washington's presidency, many folks, or at least some folks, were very vocal in their want of that, because a lot of folks still had this affection towards British royal structure. So that was also happening. But there was also this big tension within that founding period, after all this kind of happened, of what America is. And you hear a lot of different figures on the right today talk about what America is and who America is. And they will never get down to the core root of it. They will simply offer you buzzwords. And those buzzwords will have no substance to them. They will simply signal an answer that you already believe is correct without giving you any kind of edification, which is why I'm walking you all through this sort of process right here. Because if you don't understand this at its root, you will not understand what America is. And if you already do, great for you. But in order to understand that fully, you must understand these particular events. So after the war concluded, after these kind of European forces helped shape us, and some of them, of course, tried to instill their own version of what a country should be within our country, after all this happened, there was this emergent debate between two factions of the political forces within that time, the Federalists and the Jeffersonians. Now, the Federalists, like John Adams and Alexander Hamilton, these were the gentlemen whose conceptions of government, contrary to the romanticization that's often bequeathed upon all of the founders. P.S. Not all of the founders actually believed in American values. There were actually a lot of the founders, some of the founders, that wanted to import old world British notions of authority and government into our country. And Adams was one of those people. Adams firmly believed that America was nothing more than the extension of old world British beliefs. Alexander Hamilton was so infatuated with European structures that he wanted to create a central bank within the country. Now, central banking, you may not know, was actually not even an American concept. That was a concept that almost all the European powers had. And the creation of the central bank that we actually have right now, the Federal Reserve, in 1913 was actually done as a direct result of the reformers of that day looking towards how European powers structured their banking systems and then crafting a political agenda based off of that. So it actually was directly a European import. Then you had the sort of Jeffersonians. Thomas Jefferson, for example, was revolting against the sort of old dynastic rulers of the old continent. John Taylor directly contested John Adams' belief in this sort of mixed government where there should be, Adams believed strongly in this idea of having a natural aristocracy. And of course, Britain had a big aristocracy. And the aristocracy was supposed to this natural class of elite men who should have some kind of political status by virtue of their natural prowess. Well, John Taylor and the Jeffersonians said, no, first principles, moral ideas, and objective standards that go beyond our society should form the basis of how we conceive of legitimate political actions, not some kind of fatalistic or deterministic notion of what a great man is based on things he had no control over. And so you had this tension, and ultimately I believe the Jeffersonians did win out in large part, at least in the beginning. Later on, their vision kind of fell off into the abyss, but in the beginning they most certainly won out. And so there was this tension as well. Taylor said that there was a new science of politics that actually made America a distinctive nation within the world. Because this new science of politics was not based upon lineage, was not based upon status, was not based on aristocracy, was not based on the absolutism of a particular organ of government, but instead it was based on A, the use of reason, B, the presence of first principles, and C, the active participation of the people within the government. Even the well-celebrated Lord Blackstone, who most people who believe that America is an extension of Europe, or people that don't, people who are just legal scholars, will say helped birth the American common law tradition. Even Blackstone said that parliaments have a legitimate right to have absolutism. They have a legitimate right to have complete and utter control over a civilization with the people not having much of a say. Even Blackstone believed that. Now, I will give Blackstone credit. He had much more, I think, advanced views compared to the illiberal conduct of his day. Just look at the case of William Penn, for example. William Penn was persecuted within Britain for being a Quaker and defending the rights for Quakers to worship peacefully. And during that trial, the judge actually punished jurors for not finding him guilty, and that led to a revulsion amongst the common law sphere, and that led to this idea that juries ought to be independent and they ought to be protected, which we have ultimately used right here within America. So even in the beginning, we see a distinction between European identity and American identity. In the beginning, we see this great distinction, which I think makes America a unique country. The scholar and the public intellectual within the 20th century, one of my favorites, Max Lerner, actually goes on to explain the significance of the civilizational differences between Europe and America. And he explains it by really pinning down on what the glue was that held America together versus the glue that held the societies of the rest of the world together. So, for example, he says in his book, America's a Civilization, the following. He says, the Romans had a conquering zeal and a sense of historic destiny to link them, yet they also used an imperial religion to which both Machiavelli and Gibbon assign an important role in the empire's fortunes. The Japanese used the emperor god. The medieval world stressed a universal church and a system of feudal statutes and personal allegiance, and the Catholic societies of Europe and Latin America have relied on the residues of these and on the close-knit rural communities tied by honor, loyalty, and social obedience. In feudal China and in India, the cement used had been a caste system, again fused by religious traditions. England relied on a social aristocracy, an established church, the monarchy, and the rule of law. The French, since 1789, have used their revolutionary tradition and their attachment to the native soul. Russia has a myth of hostile encirclement, plus a messianic belief in the inevitable march of communism, plus a surviving, if incongruous, mystique of Holy Russia. He goes on to say, the American case has been different. None of the cementing forces which have held together these other societies, feudal, hierarchy, caste, aristocracy, monarchy, state, church, religious, revolutionary mystique has counted for much in America, with the exception of an idea like manifest destiny. Nor has authoritarianism taken hold, whether military or clerical. When the new American society broke with that of the old world, the break was not only the outer ties of dependence, but also, to a lesser extent, the inner ties that held the old society together. What American settlers did have, to start with, was a deep religious feeling and the sense of social commitment that came with it. They had, in addition, the sense of a new community being hewn out on the new continent with the world's eyes on its course, and the belief in equal opportunity. Returning to Tocqueville's remark that a democracy cannot survive without a religion and a philosophy, the Americans had as their stuff of cohesion the religion of free worship and the philosophy of equality. So, we have all kind of conceptual differences here that the sort of new world vision that America embodied had to keep us together as a society. So it's very interesting when I hear these debates today that say that that America up until the 60s, I heard this claim recently, it's a rather facile claim, that America up until the 60s is simply a extension of white European identity.
Your argument is that Trump is good for those who want a dominant white European culture.
I mean, that is what America is. It's rooted in European identity and Christian values. That's what it has been. Would you really disagree with that?
I asked myself the question, well, what European identity? Do you mean the French, the Portuguese, the Irish? Do you mean the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Scottish? Every single culture I just mentioned have vastly different identities, and they sometimes even fight over it, especially with the Irish and the Scots. They sometimes even fight over it. So you have to ask the question, what's European identity? Was America birthed from? And if the response has to be, well, a mixture thereof, then you have to also ask the question, okay, then how strong is the consistency of those identities in order for them to be truly considered to be European in the American context? And so, to answer this question, Lerner goes on to tell us, actually, that America, the American-European nexus is actually pretty interesting. He goes on to argue that America is the fulfillment of the European dream. And by the European dream, he means, at least this is my interpretation, that these ideas of revolution, these ideas of individualism, of independence, of free markets, of a laissez-faire mentality, of natural law over the law of the law and kind of kings, these ideas were originated within the European continent, but they were at the back of the minds of the Europeans who held them, so much so that they could not take form in that continent due to the suffocating systems that governed, the dominant ideas that governed Europe at that particular time. I actually want to read all of you this. So, for example, he says the following about this particular nexus between Europe and America. He says, in America, the vigorous European elements were brought into play as against the exhausted ones. It was free enterprise erased against mercantilism, laissez-faire against chimeralism, individualism against hierarchy, natural rights against monarchy, popular nationalism against the dynastic regime, social mobility against caste, the pioneering spirit against the status quo. For before the American dream, there was the European dream. Sometimes internal conflicts are resolved by revolution within, sometimes by the bursting out into colonization and revolution without. It is the settlement of America that helped drain off Europe's revolutionary energies. The revolution in America gave expression to those energies. The new world of which Europe had so long dreamed came to fruition under American skies. The European dream made America possible, and the American experience gave the European dream concreteness. He'll go on to say that the reason why it's been a popular theme within American writing to reject Europe is because it is a reenactment of the sort of father-slaying myth that is seen within societies, where the son, who embodies in this sort of archetypal way the new order, overthrows the father, who embodies the old order, and then tries to institute his own kind of idea within the father's place. But the paradox of this is that the son was taught by the father. So in some way, shape, or form, the son's governance is going to be similar in some way to the father, as even if it only has an iota of the element. You can see this in the Greek mythology, so on and so forth. Now, I'm not somebody that derives very much from archetypes. I'm a rationalist. I believe that ideas should be clear and they should be well defined, laid out, and you should be able to falsify them and test them against sound standards. And archetypes oftentimes are tools of a tyrannical imagination that run roughshod over clarity to capture this sense of wonder that is almost incalculable to anyone except the person feeling it. It's kind of like a drug boost within your veins. I do think there is some merit to this idea. But what Lerner does here is he confuses origins for character. You see, it's true. The settlers who came to this country, they either came from Africa or they came from Europe. And the Europeans, who had a lot of these different ideas, who had a lot of experiences, which made them opposed to the ideas of Europe, certainly did have a lot of ideas about how things should go. And in that sense, those ideas did come from Europe. But the character of the ideas that came to govern the United States, that came to define American civilization, even Lerner has to admit, even the most stalwart Federalist, even the most stalwart traditionalist who believes that that Britain had this immense influence on us, even they have to admit that the character of the ideas that govern our civilization in America is distinct from the character of the ideas that govern, even still to this day, many of the nations within Europe. And so for that case, even if America came from Europe, it is not of Europe. You can come from a family and not be of that family in terms of your habits, practices, and values, or in terms of how you turned out in life. When you conflate origins with character, you blur distinctions in such a way so as to ensure ignorance over any vestige of enlightenment. And that is what so many people do when they try to believe that America, or try to say that America is simply an extension of Europe. So then we go beyond this sort of civilizational talk here, and we go towards the more practical matters of how Europe has influenced us for a while. And this takes me to the late 19th century, when the Great Reapproachment, as you guys see in this picture, where this sort of strategic imperial interest of Britain and America brought them together into this sort of alliance that was seen more than just an alliance, was seen as a sort of binding of civilizations. And in this period, the progressive reformers actually began to learn from European systems and take those systems and ideas and implement them right here on American soil. There were, as I mentioned, several things during this period that were actually influenced by European ideas. There were charities. How charities were managed were directly influenced with how, in America, were directly influenced in this period with how charities are managed in Britain and in Prussia. They became managed from the top down. They became these sort of organizational and structural things which led way for control of government and political authorities over charity. Municipal management, how zoning laws were created, actually were modeled directly off of European models as well. There were several reformers who themselves said that Europe had such a better system for managing this than we in America did. Social legislation, the welfare systems of America that came to be in the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries were directly modeled off of how Europe managed its poor and its needy. And banking reform, for example, the Federal Reserve, up until this point, up until 1913, America is one of the few nations in the world that lacked a central banking system, but all the European powers had one. And so the reformers of that day figured, well, if Europe has it, we should have it as well. There are many different other areas of American society that were influenced by Europe, but here's the problem I'm trying to get to all of you. This was such a problem that it became commonplace in America during this period of time to make remarks that particular political candidates were German influenced or British influenced as opposed to American influence. There was a lot of actual animosity that was building up against European influences during the early 20th century. And then came along World War I. After around World War I, around that period of time, the level of European influence on American policymaking completely dropped off entirely, so much so that even within the Progressive Coalition, it became unfashionable to pull ideas from foreign nations. This animosity would last until the 1930s, when the New Deal, which is again just European social legislation philosophy repackaged for an American audience, came in. And then from that point onward, the European ideas were cemented. They were cemented by this perceived notion of necessity. Even to this day, a lot of folks will say that the New Deal rescued us. Well, no, the New Deal didn't rescue anything. What rescued us was, again, that sort of philosophy of free worship and ruggedness and self-reliance that motivated Americans during that period of time, during the Depression and Dust Bowl, to come together and survive despite even the harshest conditions. The New Deal came afterwards. It's simply a product of those combined efforts. But the New Deal became, within the minds of people, the ship to guide us over stormy waters. And that, coupled with the popularity of Roosevelt, and then coupled with the sort of necessity that was required by the war, which threw the American economy into this centralized, nationalized overload status. And then after that, after the war happened, threw us into this sort of mega industrialized status. All of these things together cemented the influence of European notions of social legislation and societal management over our country. And ever since then, they have not been shaken off. So, what can we learn from this, my friends? A few things. Number one, that even if President Trump has the temerity to declare geopolitical independence from Europe, there is still a strong social element and even a strong political element within our system of ideas that were imported directly from Europe, that are old-world ideas that have nothing to do with America, that are in fact corrosive to American notions, that are still governing major areas, still governing how our cities are structured, still governing how our welfare system is distributed, still governing how our banking and economic system is structured and how it runs, and still governing how our charities run, so on and so forth. There are too many examples to list. So if we're really going to declare independence from old world European notions, we must do so holistically. We must do so by taking an approach that may very well upset people, that may very well make folks who are accustomed to Europe, to habituated European ideas like Social Security, who are accustomed to habituated European ideas like food stamps and welfare, who are accustomed to habituated European ideas like the Federal Reserve and its economic wizardry. We must take those ideas and be willing to drastically cut down on them, or better yet, excise them entirely from the American political project. And in doing so, we must then reassert the original principles that made American civilization the most distinctive civilization from the caste systems of the world, from the royal hierarchies of the world, from the sort of organistic character of the Church of England, where individuality did not matter whatsoever in the face of the clergy, so on and so forth. Those ideas that made America distinctive, we must reassert them and unapologetically say, these will be the guiding North Stars of our civilization going forward. These will be what we continue to build up our country upon, and these will be the only acceptable standards by which we construct political policy. Once we do that, there will be a lot of struggle, a lot of strife, a lot of anger, but there also will be, I genuinely believe this, there also will be a renewing of our national spirit, a Renaissance age of patriotism, because patriotism must be preceded by knowledge. Affection without knowledge is not a rational love. It is an irrational feeling. It is a passion that is trying to become something more. Affection must require knowledge. Patriotism will become, I think, will be revitalized with a renewing of what it actually is. And America won't really have to worry about so much justifying itself to the world, because our mere existence will be justification, and our persistence throughout all of these many, many years will be justification enough as to the legitimacy and the virtue of our experiment. But until we rediscover who we are, by reasserting who we are, I'm afraid that we may very well be a zombified version of Europe on some level, and not in the original sense, but in the sort of perverse sense that has only been happening over the past 120 plus years. But I'm not intent on seeing that happen, and I most certainly hope you are not either. My friends, like, share, comment, subscribe, do whatever you can. If you want to support me, here is a list of links where you can support me. The best way is join my local community. That is a very secure, stable foundation for me. Join my Discord community as well, which will also, the link for that will be in the comment section down below. We talk about philosophy, history, all kind of things. And most importantly, you can also, of course, as I mentioned, send me a donation if you so please. My friends, study philosophy, study history, remain morally convicted, and please stay pensive.